Hello everyone, today we're going to be doing 2 Samuel chapters 1 to 8, all the way to 8, yep. So, yeah, I'm in a different place right now. This is not my room, by the way, this is my little cousin's room. But let's get reading. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I brought them here to my lord." Then David and all his men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called out one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down, and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel, how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no showers fall on your terraced fields, for there the shield of the mighty was despised. The shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished." In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to his family, and they settled in Hebron and its... Verse 3. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah there. When David was told that it was the men from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness, now faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asherai, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool, and one group on the other side. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin, and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazurim. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. The 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left, take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot, and every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammah, near Giah, on the way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin railed behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing them until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the troops came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight any more. All that night Abner and his men marched through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, continued through the morning hours, and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab stopped pursuing Abner and assembled the whole army. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing. But David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Caleb, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal at Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ephraim, the son of David's wife Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth said. So he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Ishbosheth did not dare to say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, "Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." "Good," said David. "I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins." So Ishbosheth gave orders and had it taken away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, "Go back home." So he went back. Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it. For the Lord promised David, 'By my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies.'" Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole tribe of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner son of Ner had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. You know Abner son of Ner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing." Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern at Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber, as if to speak with him privately, and there to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Later, when David heard about this, he said, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner son of Ner. May his blood fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family. May Joab's family never be without someone who has a running sword, or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food." Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle at Gibeon. Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner." King David himself walked behind the bier. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. All the people wept also. The king sang this lament for Abner. "Should Abner have died as the lawless died? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before the wicked." And all the people wept over him again. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets." All the people took note and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day all the people there and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. Then the king said to his men, "Do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were leaders of raiding bands. One was named Abana, and the other Rechab. They were the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, from the tribe of Benjamin. Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin because the people of Beeroth fled to Gittaim and have resided there as foreigners to this day. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. Now Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah slipped away. He had gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night by the way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothites, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their heads and feet and hung their bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here, even a blind and a lame can ward you off." They thought, "David cannot get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and lame will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stone masons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him, but David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" The Lord answered him, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." So David went to Baal-perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, the Lord hath broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal-perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim of the ark. They set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill Uzzah, and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the Ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nakan, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the Ark of God. Because the oxen stumbled, the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of the arrogant act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the Ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the Ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the Ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The Ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has, because of the Ark of God." So David went to bring up the Ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the Ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf, wearing a linen ephod. David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the Ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. As the Ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the Ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked, in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the Ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own, and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported David all the words of this entire revelation. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant, and this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord, for the sake of your word, and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are, sovereign Lord! There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth that God went out to redeem as a people for himself, and to make a name for himself, and to perform great and awesome wonders by driving out nations and their gods from before your people whom you redeemed from Egypt? You have established your people Israel as your very own forever, and you, Lord, have become their God. And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised, so that your name will be great forever. Then people will say, The Lord Almighty is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established in your sight. Lord Almighty God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing the house of your servant will be blessed forever. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Meteg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. When David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued, Edom and Moab, the Ammonites, and the Philistines and Amalek, he also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. Here we go. And that's chapters 1 to 8 of 2 Samuel. So let's go back to chapter 1 and start doing all the, chapter 1, chapter 1. Wait, where does chapter 1 begin? Okay, I couldn't find where chapter 1 began because I kept flipping over to 1 Samuel all of a sudden. Okay. Verse 1 of chapter 1 says, After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. So David had great faith in God. He patiently waited for God to fulfill his promises. The book of 1 Samuel tells of David's struggles as he waited to become king of Israel. Samuel had anointed David as king of Israel many years earlier, and King Saul became jealous of David because the people kept praising him for his military accomplishments. Eventually, Saul's jealousy became so intense that he tried to kill David several times. As a result, David had to escape for many years. David hid from Saul in enemy territory and in the vast wilderness south and east of Jerusalem. David may have wondered when God's promise that he would be king would come true, but his struggles prepared him for the great responsibilities he would later face. The book of 2 Samuel tells how David was finally rewarded for his patience and consistent faith in God. When Saul died, David and his men were still living in Ziklag, a Philistine city, because Saul had driven him out of Israel. David had pretended to be loyal to Achish, a Philistine ruler, that God had kept him safe from Saul. Verse 11 to 12 says, Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David and his men were visibly shaken over Saul's death. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening. The actions showed their genuine sorrow over the loss of their king, their friend Jonathan, and the other soldiers of Israel who had died that day. They were not ashamed to grieve. Today, some people consider expressing emotions to be a sign of weakness. Those who wish to appear strong try to hide their feelings, but expressing our grief can help us deal with that intense sorrow when a loved one dies. Verse 13 says, David said to the young man who brought him the report, Where are you from? I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite, he answered. The Amalekites were a fierce nomadic tribe that frequently conducted surprise raids on Canaanite villages. They had been Israel's enemies since Moses' time. David had just destroyed an Amalekite band of raiders who had burned his city and kidnapped its women and children. This man was probably unaware of David's recent confrontations with the Amalekites, or he may not have come. Instead, he incurred David's wrath by posing as an enemy of Israel and claiming to have killed God's chosen king. The man identified himself as an Amalekite from Saul's camp. He may have been an Amalekite under Israelite jurisdiction, but more likely, he was a battlefield scavenger. Obviously, the man was lying both about his identity and about what had happened on the battlefield. Because he had Saul's crown with him, something the Philistines wouldn't have left behind, we can infer that he had found Saul dead on the battlefield before the Philistines had arrived. As it happened for the Amalekite, a life of deceit often leads to grave consequences for the liar, even for things he or she may not have done. This man lied, most likely to gain some personal reward for killing David's rival, but he misread David's character. If David had rewarded him for murdering the king, David would have shared his guilt instead. David had the messenger killed. This may seem to be an overly severe punishment, but there are a few crimes more serious than killing the Lord's anointed king, a crime David himself had refused to commit a number of times. Verse 15 to 16 says, Then David called one of his men and said, Go strike him down. So he struck him down, and he died, for David had said to him, Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. Although Saul had been trying to kill David for many years, David did not celebrate Saul's death. In spite of all that Saul had done against him, David maintained respect for Saul's position as God's anointed servant. Since David believed that God had anointed Saul, it followed that only God was in position to remove him from office. If he became casual or commonplace to assassinate the king, the whole society would become chaotic. It was God's job, not David's, to judge Saul's sins. When looking at our own leaders, religious or civil, we may be tempted to become angry, despairing, or fearful. But despite their shortcomings, we must realize that God has placed rulers in authority over us, and we should maintain respect for the positions they hold. We talk about that a lot in Romans, about holding respect for, government authorities and obeying them no matter what decree they put out. Only reason for us to disobey government leadership is if they tell us to disobey God. That's the only reason we are able to disobey government leadership. Verse 17 to 27 of chapter 21 is a lament for Saul and Jonathan. David was a talented musician. He played the harp. He organized musicians and music for worship at the tabernacle, later to be used at the temple, and he wrote many of the Psalms. Here we are told that he wrote a lament in memory of Saul and his son Jonathan, David's closest friend. Music played an important role in Israel's history. We see Moses made a song, Deborah made a song. People sung about David, how Saul has killed thousands and David has killed tens of thousands. You know that in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, I think, something like that. But Saul had caused much trouble for David, but when he died, David composed a lament in memory of the king and his son. David had every reason to hate Saul, but he chose not to. Instead, he chose to look at the good Saul had done and to ignore the times when Saul had attacked him. It takes courage to lay aside hurt and painful memories and to respect the positive side of another person, especially an enemy. Verse 26 says, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. By saying that Jonathan's love was more wonderful than that of women, David was not implying that he had a sexual relationship with Jonathan. Practicing practicing homosexuality was forbidden. David was simply describing the deep brotherhood and faithful friendship he had with Jonathan, and that stuff is still forbidden. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah? He asked. The Lord said, Go up. David asked, Where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. Although David knew he would become king, and although the time seemed right now that Saul was dead, David still asked God if he should move back to Judah, the home territory of his tribe. Before moving ahead with that seems obvious, we should first bring the matter to God, who alone knows the best timing. God told David to return to Hebron, where he soon would be crowned king of Judah. David made Hebron his capital. David made Hebron his capital because it was the largest city in Judah at that time. It was secure against attack. It was located near the center of Judah's territory, an ideal location for a capital city, and many key trade routes converged at Hebron, making it difficult for supply lines to be cut off in wartime. Verse 4 says, Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. When David was told that it was the men from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, the men of Judah publicly anointed David as the king. David had been anointed king by Samuel years earlier, but that ceremony had been taking place in private. This one was like the inauguration of a public official who had already been elected to office. The rest of Israel, however, didn't accept David's kingship for another 7.5 years. Verse 5 to 7 says, He sent messengers to them to say to them, The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them. David sent a message thanking the men of Jabesh Gilead who had risked their lives to bury Saul's body. Saul had rescued Jabesh Gilead from sudden defeat, but Nahash the Ammonite had surrounded the city, so these citizens were showing their gratitude and kindness. In his message, he also suggested that they follow Judah's lead and acknowledge him as their king. Jabesh Gilead was to the north in the land of Gilead, and David was seeking to gain support among the 10 remaining tribes who had not yet recognized him as king. Verse 8 to 9 says, Meanwhile, Abner son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth son of Saul and brought him over to Mahanaim, who made him king over Gilead, Asheri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. The nation of Israel split in two after Saul's death. 10 tribes followed Ishbosheth, one of Saul's surviving sons. 2 tribes, Judah and Simeon, followed David. Abner, Saul's general, rallied Israel around Ishbosheth. He was no doubt afraid that he, as the opposing general, would be killed if David became king of all Israel. Judah pledged allegiance to David because he was from their own tribe, he had kept close ties with them, and he had protected the land and shared battle spoils with them. In addition, the elders of Judah may have known that Samuel had anointed David as Israel's next king, and that therefore he was God's choice. Verse 10 to 11 says, Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king of Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. David ruled over Judah for 7.5 years, while Ishbosheth reigned in Israel for only 2 years. The 5-year gap may be due to Ishbosheth not assuming the throne immediately after Saul's death. Because of constant danger from the Philistines in the northern part of Israel, 5 years may have passed before Ishbosheth could begin his reign. During that time, Abner, commander of his army, probably played a principal role in driving out the Philistines and leading the North Confederacy. Regardless of when Ishbosheth began to rule, his control was weak and limited. The Philistines still dominated the area, and Ishbosheth was intimidated by Abner. When Israel divided, there was constant tension between the north and south. David's true rival in the north, however, was not Ishbosheth, but Abner. We see Abner suggest hand-to-hand combat in verses 12 to 17. He did that between the champions of his army and the champions of David's army, led by Joab, or Yoab. It is pronounced Joab or Yoab. But the fact that this confrontation occurred at the pool of Gibeon, located in Saul's home territory of Benjamin, suggests that Joab's men were pushing northward, gaining more territory. Abner may have suggested this confrontation in the hopes of stopping Joab's advance. 12 men from each side were supposed to fight each other, and the side with the most survivors would be declared the winner. The confrontation between David and Goliath was a similar battle strategy, a way to avoid terrible bloodshed from an all-out war. In this case, however, all 24 were killed before either side could claim victory. The civil war continued, but David's troops won the battle. 21 to 23 says, Then Abner said to him, Turn aside to the right or to the left, take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons. But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again Abner warned Asahel, Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face? But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on that spot, and every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. Abner repeatedly warned Asahel to turn back or risk losing his life, but Asahel refused to turn from his self-imposed duty. Abner was more skilled in battle, but he knew killing Asahel would unleash a cycle of revenge from his brother Joab. Persistence is a good trait if it is for a worthy cause, but if the goal is only personal honor or gain, persistence may be no more than stubbornness. Asahel's stubbornness not only cost him his life, but also spurred unfortunate disunity in David's army for years to come. Before you decide to pursue a goal, make sure it is worthy of your devotion. Verse 28 says, So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the troops came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight anymore. This battle ended with a victory for Joab's troop. The war in the divided nation continued until David was finally crowned king over all Israel. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. The events recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 2 led to a long war between David's followers and the troops loyal to Abner and Ishbosheth. Civil war rocked the country at great cost to both sides. Israel and Judah had lost sight of God's vision and purpose for them to settle the land, to drive out the Canaanites, and to obey God's laws. Instead of uniting to accomplish these goals, they fought each other. When you face conflict, step back from the hostilities and consider whether you and your enemy have common goals that are bigger than your differences. Appeal to those interests as you work for a positive outcome. Chapter 3, verses 2 to 5 says, Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Gilead, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ethream, the son of David's wife Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. David suffered much heartache because of his many wives. Polygamy was a socially acceptable practice for kings at this time, although God has specifically warned about it. Sadly, the numerous sons born to David's wives caused him great trouble. rage, murder, rebellion, and greed all resulted from the jealous rivalries among the half-brothers. Solomon, one of David's sons and his successor to the throne, also took many wives. A lot, actually. More than David probably did. Definitely more than David, actually. And those wives of Saul, not Saul, and the wives of Solomon did eventually turn Solomon away from God. Although most people don't practice polygamy today, people who divorce or remarry also must guard against rivalry among their children. Verse 6 to 7 says, during the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why did you sleep with my father's concubine? To sleep with any of the king's wives or concubine was to make a claim to the throne, and it was considered treason. Because Ishbosheth was a weak ruler, Abner was running the country, thus he may have felt justified in sleeping with Saul's concubine. Ishbosheth, however, saw that Abner's power was becoming too great. Ishbosheth may have been right to speak out against Abner's behavior, but he didn't have the moral strength to maintain his authority. Lack of moral backbone became the root of Israel's troubles over the next 4 centuries. In the coming centuries, very few kings in Israel and Judah would be called good. It takes courage and strength to stand firm in your convictions and to confront wrongdoing in the face of opposition. When you believe something is wrong, do not let yourself be talked out of your position. Firmly deny the wrong and uphold the right. Verse 8 says, Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth said, so he answered, am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. By saying, am I a dog's head on Judah's side, Abner meant, am I a traitor for Judah? He may have been refuting the accusation that he was trying to take over the throne, or he may have been angry that Ishbosheth was scolding him after Abner had helped him put him on the throne in the first place. Prior to this conversation, Abner had realized that he could not keep David from eventually taking over Israel. Because he was very angry at Ishbosheth, Abner devised a plan to turn over the kingdom of Israel to David in return for being made general of David's army. Verse 12 to 13 says, then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you. Good, said David, I'll make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. By this time, Abner realized that it was useless to fight for the weak ruler Ishbosheth. Nothing could prevent David from becoming king of Israel because God was with him. Abner designed a deal with David to prevent David's men from seeking revenge against him for being the commander of both Saul's army and the Northern Confederacy. In an effort to reunite all Israel, David agreed to Abner's deal. Ishbosheth was not God's appointed king as Saul had been, therefore David accepted Abner's terms. This chair is very squeaky. Verse 14 to 16 says, then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, demanding, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. And Abner said to him, go back home, so he went back. Michal had been married to David. Saul had arranged the marriage as a reward for David's acts of bravery. Later, however, in one of his jealous fits, Saul took Michal away from David and forced her to marry Paltiel. Now David wanted his wife back before he would begin to negotiate peace with the northern tribes. Perhaps David still loved her, for the tension in them, they began to have tension in the relationship though, but more likely he thought that marriage of Saul's daughter would strengthen his claim to rule all Israel and demonstrate that he had no animosity towards Saul's house. Paltiel was the unfortunate victim caught in the web of Saul's jealousy and David's political maneuvering. Verse 19 says, Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole tribe of Benjamin wanted to do. Saul, Ishbosheth, and Abner were all from the tribe of Benjamin. So Abner's work to gain the support of the elders of the tribe proved that he was serious about his offer to help bringing unity. There was now a strong possibility of overcoming tribal jealousies and uniting the kingdom. Verse 26 to 29 says, Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern at Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber as if to speak with him privately, and there to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach and he died. Later, when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family. May Joab's family never be without someone who has a running sword, or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. Joab took revenge for the death of his brother instead of leaving justice to God, but that revenge backfired on him. God will repay those who deserve it. Refuse to rejoice when your enemies suffer, and don't try to get revenge. Seeking revenge, even when you feel justified, will ruin your own peace of mind and increase the chances of further retaliation. Abner had killed Joab's brother Asahel in self-defense. On top of that, Abner actually had been trying to run away from Asahel. But Joab treacherously murdered Abner to avenge his brother's death and to save his position of military leadership. Joab killed Abner in Hebron, a city of refuge where Abner should have been safe from an avenger. Although Asahel's death was not accidental, Hebron was a place of refuge and the most inappropriate place for revenge. But Joab did not care and did as he pleased. Joab was later executed at Solomon's command, fulfilling the punishment required under the law for murder. Why did David say such harsh words about Joab? David was upset over Abner's death for several reasons. He was grieved over the loss of a skilled military officer. He wanted to place the guilt of Abner's murder on Joab, not himself. He was on the verge of becoming king over the entire nation, and having Abner's support was important for winning over the northern tribes. Abner's death could have revived the civil war. Joab had violated David's agreement to protect Abner. Joab's murderous act ruined David's plans, and David was especially angry that his own commander had committed the crime. David ordered Joab to mourn after this, in front of Abner as well, which Abner was dead. But possibly he did this possibly because few people were aware that Joab had committed the crime, and because David did not want any further trouble. If this is true, David was thinking more about strengthening his kingdom than about justice. Verse 31 says, Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner. King David himself walked behind the bier. By walking behind the procession, that is behind the bier or casket, David was leading the mourning. Verse 39 says, And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds. Joab and Abishai were the two sons of Zeruiah whom David mentioned. David had an especially hard time controlling Joab because although he was intensely loyal, he was strong-willed, preferring to do things his own way. In exchange for his loyalty, however, David was willing to give Joab the flexibility he craved. But in the long run, David was too soft on Joab. This leadership flaw would cost David dearly. Joab's murder of Abner is an example of his fierce independence. While David opposed the murder, he allowed it to remain unpunished because to punish Joab could cause the troops to rebel. Joab was David's nephew, and any harsh treatment could cause family problems. Joab was from the tribe of Judah, and David didn't want rebellion from his own tribe, and to get rid of Joab would mean losing a skilled and competent commander who had been invaluable in strengthening his army. Chapter 4, verse 1 says, When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Ishbosheth was a man who took his courage from another man, Abner, rather than from God. When Abner died, Ishbosheth was left with nothing. In crisis and under pressure, he collapsed in fear. Fear can paralyze us, but faith and trust in God can overcome fear. If we trust God, we will be free to respond boldly to events around us. Verse 11 and 12 says, How much more, when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their heads, they cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. David called Ishbosheth an innocent man. As Saul's son, Ishbosheth had reason to think he was in line for the throne. He was not wicked for wanting to be king. Rather, he was simply too weak to stand against injustice. Although David knew that Ishbosheth was not the leader God wanted to unite the people of Israel, he had no intention of killing him. God had promised the kingdom to David, and he knew that God would fulfill his promise. When David learned of Ishbosheth's death, he was angry. David had never harmed Saul, and he thought the assassin's method was cowardly. David wanted to unite Israel, not drive a permanent wedge between him and Ishbosheth's supporters. To show that he had nothing to do with the extermination of Saul's royal line, David ordered the assassins killed and gave Ishbosheth a proper burial. All the tribes of Israel, recognizing in David the strong leader they needed, pledged their loyalty to him. No doubt the Philistine threat and David's military reputation also helped unify the people. Verse 3 to 5 of chapter 5 says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over Israel and Judah 33 years. This was the third time David was anointed king. First, he was privately anointed by Samuel. Then he was made king over the tribe of Judah. Finally, he was crowned king over Israel. David's life as an outlaw had looked bleak, but God's promise to make him king over all Israel was now being fulfilled. Although the kingdom would be divided again in less than 75 years, David's dynasty would reign over Judah, the southern kingdom, for over 400 years. David did not become king over all Israel until he was 37 years old. Although he had been promised the kingdom many years earlier, during those years, David had to wait patiently for the fulfillment of God's promise. If you feel pressured to achieve results and success quickly, remember David's patience. Just as his time of waiting prepared him for his important task, a waiting period may help prepare you for whatever God has planned. Verse 6 to 7 says, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here, even the blind and the lame can ward you off. They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. The fortress of Zion, which became the city of Jerusalem, was located on a high ridge near the center of the united Israelite kingdom. It was considered neutral territory because it stood on the border of the territory of the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, and it was still occupied by the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe who had never been expelled from the land. Because of its strategic advantages, David made Jerusalem his capital. The Jebusites had a clear military advantage, and they boasted of their security behind the impregnable walls of Jerusalem, also called Zion, but they soon discovered that their walls would not protect them. David caught them by surprise by entering the city through the water tunnel. Only in God are we truly safe and secure, although anything else is false security. Whether you are surrounded by mighty walls of stone, a comfortable home, or a secure job, no one can predict what tomorrow may bring. Our relationship with God is the only security that cannot be taken away. Verse 12 says, that David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and they had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. Although the pagan kingdoms based their greatness on conquest, power, armies, and wealth, David knew that his greatness came only from God. To David, being great meant keeping a close relationship with God, personally and nationally. To do this, David had to keep his ambition under control. Although he was famous, successful, and well-liked, he gave God first place in his life and served the people according to God's purposes. Do you seek greatness from God or from people? In the drive for success, remember to keep your ambition under God's control. Verse 13 says, after he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. Although David sincerely sought after God, he had weaknesses like any other person. One of those weaknesses was his desire for many wives. Sadly, the children born to these wives caused David and the kingdom much grief. David also set an unhealthy pattern for his son Solomon. Verse 17 says, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him, but David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. The Philistine oppression of Israel had begun in the days of Samson. The Philistines were still Israel's most powerful enemy, even though David had once been considered a friend and ally. Because they occupied much of Israel's northern territory, they apparently did not bother David while he was king of Judah to the south. But when they learned that David was planning to unite all Israel, they tried to stop him. The stronghold is a mountain stronghold in the desert of Judah that David had used when defending himself against Saul, which we'll talk about later on in chapter 23. Verse 19 says, so David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands? David fought his battles the way God instructed him. In each instance, he asked if he should fight or not, followed instructions carefully, and gave God the glory. We can err in our battles by ignoring these steps and instead doing what we want without considering God's will, doing things our way and ignoring advice in the Bible or from wise people we consult, and taking the glory ourselves or giving it to someone else without acknowledging the help we receive from God. Responding this way is very sinful. Verse 25 says, So, so David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. After David became king, his first order of business was to subdue his enemies, a task the nation had failed to complete when they had first entered the land. David knew this had to be done in order to protect the nation, unify the kingdom, and prepare for building the temple, which would unify the people's religious practices under God and help abolish idolatrous influences. Chapter 6, verse 3 says, They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart. The ark of God was the national treasure in Israel and was symbolic of God's presence among the people. It was ordinarily kept in the tabernacle. When the ark of God returned to Israel after a brief Philistine captivity, it was kept in Abinadab's home for 20 years. By bringing the ark to Jerusalem, David demonstrated that both the people of Israel and he, as their king, were submitted completely to God's rule. Unlike during Saul's reign, David also demonstrated his desire for God's close presence and blessing. Verse 6-7 says, When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God, because the ark stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of the irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Uzzah was only trying to protect the ark, so was God's anger against Uzzah just? According to Numbers chapter 4, verses 5-15, the ark was to be moved only by Levites, who were to carry it using the carrying poles. They were never to touch the ark itself. To touch it was a capital offense under Hebrew law. God's action was directed against both David and Uzzah. David placed the ark on a cart, following the Philistines' example, rather than God's commands. Uzzah, though sincere in his desire to protect the ark, had to face the consequences of the sin of touching it. Also, Uzzah may not have been a Levite. As David sought to bring Israel back into a relationship with God, God had to dramatically remind him and the people that enthusiasm must be accompanied by obedience to his laws. The next time David tried to bring the ark to Jerusalem, he was careful to handle it correctly. Verse 8-12 says, Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. David was angry that a well-meaning man had been killed and that his plans for a joyous return of the ark had been spoiled. He undoubtedly knew that the fault was his own for transporting the ark carelessly. After cooling down, he had the ark put into temporary storage while he waited to see if the Lord would allow him to bring it up to Jerusalem. This also gave David time to consider the right way to transport the ark. The fact that God had blessed the home of Obed-Edom was a sign to David that he should try once again to move the ark to Jerusalem. Verse 14 says, Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. David wore a linen ephod, the priest's apron, because the celebration was national and religious. Perhaps he had removed his royal clothing as an act of sincerity and humility. Verse 16-23 says, As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Then they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and asked how the king of Israel had distinguished himself today, going around half naked, in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. David said to Michal, It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Michal was David's first wife, but here she is called the daughter of Saul, possibly to show how similar her attitude was to her father's. Her contempt but David probably did not start with David's grand entrance into the city. Perhaps he thought it was undignified to be so expressive in public worship at a time when it was so neglected in the kingdom. Or maybe she thought it was not fitting for a king to display such emotion. She may also have resented David's taking. She may have also resented David's taken from her Patiel, who loved her. Whatever the reason, this contempt she felt toward her husband escalated into a difficult confrontation, and Michal ended up childless for life. Feelings of bitterness and resentment that go unchecked will destroy a person's relationship with God and with others. If you have these feelings, go to someone you trust and deal with them before they escalate into open warfare. Only a priest could place these sacrifices on the altar. Leviticus chapter 1 verses 2 to 13 indicates that anyone who was ceremonially clean could assist a priest in offering the sacrifice. So David probably offered these sacrifices to God with the aid of a priest. Solomon would do the same. Michal was disgusted. I can't say disgusted. I was able to say, but Michal was disgusted with David as he led the ox procession into Jerusalem. Like her father Saul, she was concerned about outward appearances, but David focused on the inward condition of his heart before God. He was willing to look foolish in the eyes of some in order to worship God more fully and honestly. People may worship God in ways that look foolish to us because we have a different culture or tradition from theirs. We should accept their heartfelt expressions of worship. We should also not be afraid to express our feelings of love and devotion toward God even when others are present. On to chapter 7 now. This chapter records the covenant made with David, promising to carry on David's line forever. The promise would be fully realized in the birth of Jesus Christ. Although the word covenant is not specifically stated in the Bible here, it is used elsewhere to describe this occasion. Verse 2 says, "He said to Nathan the prophet, 'Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent.'" This is the first time Nathan the prophet is mentioned. We know nothing of his background. God made certain that at least one prophet was living during the reign of each of the kings of Israel. The prophet's main task was to urge the people to follow God and to communicate God's laws and plans. God made certain that at least one prophet was living during the reign of each of the kings of Israel. The prophet's main task was to urge the people to follow God and to communicate God's laws and plans to the king. Most of the kings rejected the prophets God sent, but at least God had given them the opportunity to listen and obey. David often inquired of the Lord before he went to battle. We see that a lot. And he really listened to him. He did that a lot before he did it in battle. Like, should I go down and strike down these Philistines? Should I go down and fight the Amalekites? He did it quite a lot. But in earlier years, judges and priests had the role of prophets. Samuel served as judge, priest, and prophet, bridging the gap between the period of the judges and that of the monarchy. Verse 5 says, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in?" In this message from Nathan, God was saying that he didn't want David to build a house for him. Why didn't God want David to build the temple? God told David that his job was to unify and lead Israel and to destroy its enemies. This huge task would require David to shed a great deal of blood. In 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 3 of chapter 28, 1 Chronicles, we learn that God did not want his temple built by a warrior. So David made the plans and collected the materials so that his son Solomon could begin work on the temple as soon as he became king. David accepted his part in God's plan and did not try to go beyond it. Sometimes God says no to our plans. When he does, we should take part in other opportunities he gives us. And David requests to build a temple. David's request to build the temple was good, but God said no to it. This does not mean that God rejected David. In fact, God was planning to do something even greater in David's life than allowing him the prestige of building the temple. Although God turned down David's request, he promised to continue the house or dynasty of David forever. David's earthly dynasty ended 4 centuries later, but Jesus Christ, a direct descendant of David, was the ultimate fulfillment of this promise. Christ will reign for eternity, now in his spiritual kingdom and in heaven, and later on earth in the New Jerusalem. Have you prayed with good intentions only to have God say no? This is God's way of directing you to a greater purpose in your life. Accepting God's no may require as great faith as carrying out his yes. Verses 18 to 29, this section records David's prayer expressing his humble acceptance of God's promise to extend his dynasty forever. As he sat in the tent where the ark was being kept, David realized that these blessings were given to him and his descendants in order that Israel might benefit from them. They would fulfill God's greater purpose and promises that through the people of Israel, the whole world would be blessed. Verse 28 says, Sovereign Lord, you are God, your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. David knew that God's words were true, and he based his life on them. People search in many places for truth on which to base their lives. Yet, as David knew, God's word is the only trustworthy foundation upon which to build a life. Verses 1 to 5 of chapter 8 says, In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Meteg and Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were to be put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. Part of God's covenant with David included the promise that the Israelites' enemies would be defeated and would no longer oppress them. God fulfilled this promise by helping David defeat the opposing nations. Several enemies are listed in this chapter. The Moabites, who were the descendants of Lot, living east of the Jordan. I'm almost done, by the way. Alright. Yeah, Moabites. We're talking about Moabites, right? It was Moabites, right? Yeah, the Moabites, they were descendants of Lot living east of the Dead Sea who posed a constant military and religious threat to Israel. David seemed to have had a good relationship with the Moabites at the time. He had sent his parents there for protection from King Saul, and his great-grandmother Ruth had been from Moab. King Hadadezer of Zobah, whose defeat at David's hands fulfilled God's promise to Abraham that Israel would control the land as far as north the Euphrates River. The Edomites, who were descendants of Esau and were also arch enemies of Israel, and that was all. Verse 6 says, He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. This tribute was the tax levied on conquered nations. The tax helped support Israel's government and demonstrated that the conquered nations were under Israel's control. Verse 15 says, David reigned over all Israel doing what was just and right for all his people. David pleased the people not because he set out to please them, but because he tried to please God. Often those who try the hardest to become popular never make it, but the praise of people is not that important. Don't spend your time devising ways to become accepted in the public eye. Instead, strive to do what is right, and both God and his people will respect your convictions. King David's reign was characterized by justice, which means he interpreted the law fairly. He administered punishment with mercy and respected the people's rights and recognized the people's duty toward God. Is it any wonder that almost everyone trusted and followed David? Why was it good for David to pursue justice? It was God's command, and in keeping with his character, God's laws were meant to establish a just society. It was in the nation's best interest because times would arise when each individual would need justice. Justice should characterize the way you relate to people. Make sure you stand up for the just treatment of everyone, especially the poor, prisoners, the unborn, the victims of abuse, the oppressed, and the disenfranchised, both in the community and everywhere around the world. So that is it for 2 Samuel chapters 1 to 8. But thinking about doing 9 and 16 later, those chapters. I'm usually in like a big spinny chair, but somewhere else, so I'm sitting in this little small lawn chair. But we are like 40% of the way through the Old Testament too, so I want to hit Revelations by the end of the year, but who knows? We might get to it in like April of next year. Who knows, but we'll get there. So, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Lord, I ask that you give us wisdom and understanding, Lord. I ask that you make us powerful in, conquering sin, Lord. I ask that you make us strong and you give us courage, Lord. I ask that you give us bravery. I ask that you give us love and caring, Lord. I ask that you show your power through us, Lord. I ask that you spread your word through us, Lord. I ask that you show us dreams and visions and speak to us and through your word, Lord. I ask that if there's anyone who doesn't have you, they can pursue you, and if there is people who already do have you, that they continue to pursue you and will pursue others in your name, so they too may be able to pursue others. I ask that if there's anyone suffering, they may suffer joyfully, knowing that you will uphold them with your righteous right hand. I thank you and praise you for all these things. I pray all these things in your name. Amen. Good night. God bless. Love y'all and see y'all next time.